My name is Melody. I am 34, and the day my husband decided I was useless, he called my mother on speaker and told her to come pick me up because he did not want me anymore. She agreed and said she would arrive in 30 minutes. Gavin had no idea I had already sent one encrypted message. Before the night ended, 5 black SUVs would fill our driveway and change everything. Tell me where you are watching from and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy, hollow thud of my vintage leather suitcase hitting the top step echoed through our spacious suburban home. I stood at the bottom of the modern hardwood staircase, my hand resting lightly on the cool metal banister. I watched with a quiet, detached fascination as the suitcase tumbled down, gaining momentum with each violent impact against the polished oak. The brass clasp snapped open on the 4th step, spilling a carefully folded pile of my simple, unbranded sweaters and sensible denim jeans across the landing. The suitcase finally hit the bottom floor with a dull smack, coming to rest just inches from my practical canvas sneakers. I did not flinch. I did not cry out. I simply looked up. Standing at the top of the stairs, bathed in the warm, expensive lighting of our newly renovated second-floor hallway, was Gavin. He was 35 years old, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that screamed corporate ambition. His hair was perfectly styled, and a smug, victorious grin twisted his handsome features into something completely unrecognizable to the man I had married 6 years ago. But Gavin was not alone. Leaning casually against his shoulder, her hand resting possessively on his chest, was Brittany. She was 28, a junior executive from his firm, smelling strongly of an overpowering floral perfume that I had been noticing on Gavin's shirts for the past 4 months. Brittany wore a tight designer crimson dress, her blonde hair cascading in perfect expensive waves. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity mixed with arrogant triumph. It was the look of a woman who fully believed she had just won the ultimate prize, completely unaware that she had simply claimed a sinking ship. "I am filing for divorce," Melody Gavin announced. His voice was loud, carrying easily through the open, airy space of the house I had spent years maintaining. He did not sound apologetic or remorseful. He sounded like a corporate raider announcing a successful acquisition. "The paperwork was submitted this morning. I am done." I kept my posture completely neutral, my breathing slow and measured. The silence stretched between us for a long moment, filled only by the ambient hum of the central air conditioning. Gavin frowned slightly, clearly expecting a different reaction. He had anticipated tears, begging perhaps a dramatic breakdown on the foyer floor. When I offered none of that, his smug grin hardened into a sneer. "Did you hear me, Melody? I said I am done," Gavin repeated, taking one step down the stairs to loom over me. "I am tired of carrying your dead weight. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to be the sole provider for this household? To come home after a grueling 12-hour day at the firm, busting my back to secure our financial future, only to find you sitting in the guest bedroom in your sweatpants clicking away at some worthless freelance spreadsheet gig." I looked at the scattered clothes on the stairs, then back up to him. "My freelance data entry gig," I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft and steady. "That is what you think I do." "It is what you do," Brittany chimed in. Her voice was high-pitched and grating, dripping with condescension. "Gavin tells me you literally format spreadsheets for pennies. It is cute that you have a little hobby to keep yourself busy, but Gavin is playing in the major leagues now. He needs a partner who understands corporate strategy, not someone who thinks balancing a budget column is a hard day of work." Gavin chuckled, wrapping his arm tighter around Brittany's waist. "She is right, Melody. I am slated to become a senior vice president at Vanguard Financial by the end of this quarter. My career is taking off in ways you cannot even begin to comprehend. I am moving into elite circles, dealing with massive portfolios, dining with industry leaders. I cannot have a wife who shrinks in the corner at networking events because she does not know the difference between a mutual fund and a hedge fund. You do not fit into my world anymore. You never really did." I slowly walked over to my suitcase and began picking up my sweaters, folding them with deliberate, meticulous care. Every movement was precise. Inside, I felt a strange, cold sense of validation. For years, Gavin had mistaken my privacy for weakness, and my refusal to advertise myself for a lack of ambition. He had built an entire marriage around assumptions he had never bothered to verify. I had stopped correcting him long ago, partly because arguing with a man committed to misunderstanding me was exhausting, and partly because there were things about my work, my finances, and the life I had built that were safer left unexplained. Tonight, for the first time, his ignorance no longer felt insulting. It felt useful. He thought he understood exactly how powerless I was, and that certainty was making him reckless. "You need to leave," Gavin demanded, his tone turning sharp and authoritative. His impatience was growing because my calmness was entirely throwing off his script. "I want you out of this house today." "This house," I repeated, snapping the brass clasps of my suitcase shut. "Yes, my house," Gavin snapped. "I pay the mortgage. I pay the property taxes. My name is on the bank accounts that fund this lifestyle. You have contributed absolutely nothing to this marriage. So grab your cheap bags and call a cab." Brittany let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Honestly, Melody, you should be thanking him. He let you live rent-free for 6 years. Most women would be grateful for that kind of charity." I stood up, gripping my suitcase. The audacity of his claims was almost comical. Gavin spoke about the house with the confidence of a man who had never read the documents behind the payments he made every month. He saw money leaving his account and assumed that meant ownership. I had never corrected him. I simply looked around the living room at walls he already treated like conquered territory, and reminded myself that some truths were more effective when revealed at exactly the right moment. "I am not leaving right now, Gavin," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with icy clarity. Gavin marched down the stairs, stopping just 2 steps above me to maintain his height advantage. Brittany followed closely behind him. "You do not get to make demands," Gavin growled, pointing a finger at my face. "You have no money. You have no career. You have absolutely no leverage in this situation. I am giving you a 10-minute head start to walk out the front door before I start throwing the rest of your garbage onto the lawn. I am cutting you off." I looked at his pointing finger, then slowly met his eyes. "You are making a very large mistake, Gavin," I said softly. "Do not threaten me," he laughed. "What are you going to do? Sue me for half of the $200 in your freelance checking account? You are a joke, Melody." I did not raise my voice. I did not explain why his confidence about his career sounded almost surreal to me. I simply stood my ground and let him keep talking. "Are you finished?" I asked. Gavin's face turned red. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, a vicious gleam appearing in his eyes. "Let us see how tough you are when we get some family involved. Let us see what your mother has to say about her daughter getting thrown out." I watched him dial her number, knowing this phone call would change absolutely everything. The ringing of the phone seemed to echo endlessly against the high vaulted ceilings of the hallway. Gavin held the device out in front of him like a weapon. The speakerphone activated, his thumb hovering near the screen as he waited for the connection. Beside him, Brittany shifted her weight, a pleased smile playing on her glossy lips. She looked genuinely entertained, watching me as if I were an exhibit in a museum of failed marriages. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stairs, feeling the smooth wood of the banister under my palm. A normal wife might have been hyperventilating, begging him to put the phone away, pleading for her dignity to be spared. But I was not a normal wife, and my dignity was no longer tied to anything Gavin or my family had to say. "Hello," my mother answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was sharp, carrying the familiar tone of someone who always felt she was being interrupted from something far more important. "Beatrice, it is Gavin," he said, puffing out his chest and using his most authoritative corporate voice. "I am calling to tell you to come pick up your useless daughter. I do not want her anymore." I waited for the gasp. I waited for the sudden silence of a mother processing the shock of her son-in-law brutally discarding her child. Any decent parent would have immediately demanded to know what was happening, asked if I was safe, or at least yelled at the man speaking so cruelly to their flesh and blood. Instead, a heavy burdened sigh crackled through the speaker. It was a sound I had heard my entire life. It was the sound of my mother being profoundly inconvenienced by my very existence. "Oh, Gavin," Beatrice groaned, her voice dripping with exhaustion rather than concern. "What has she done now? I swear that girl has been nothing but a constant source of stress since the day she was born. Do not tell me she is throwing a tantrum over something trivial again." Gavin chuckled a low, victorious sound that vibrated with malice. He glanced down at me, his eyes shining with pure spite. No, she is just standing here like a piece of furniture, which is exactly how she has acted for the last 6 years. I filed for divorce this morning, Beatrice. I am absolutely done. My career at Vanguard Financial is taking off, and I simply cannot be dragged down by a woman whose biggest daily accomplishment is formatting freelance spreadsheets in the guest bedroom. She brings nothing to the table. She has zero ambition, zero drive, and zero understanding of what it takes to support a successful man. I listened to him dismantle my character with a sense of clinical detachment. It was almost fascinating to hear how completely he had bought into the false narrative I had allowed him to believe. He truly thought I was a fragile, unmotivated dependent who relied on him for survival. He had no idea that my simple wardrobe and quiet days at home were a carefully constructed shield to protect my true assets from his greedy, grasping hands. "I am so sorry, Gavin," my mother said, and the genuine apology in her voice felt like a physical blow. "I have told her time and time again that she needed to step up. When you married her, I warned her that a man of your caliber needed a real partner. But Melody has always been stubborn and lazy. She never wanted to put in the actual work to build a respectable life. She is absolutely nothing like her brother." There it was, the inevitable comparison. In my family, Mason was the golden standard by which all my failures were measured. My mother could never miss an opportunity to elevate her favorite child while stepping on my neck. Mason just secured another round of funding for his new startup. Beatrice continued, completely disregarding the fact that her daughter's marriage had just imploded in spectacular fashion. "He is a true visionary, Gavin. He understands hustle and dedication. Melody just wanted to coast on your hard work and enjoy the luxury of a house you pay for. I always feared she would end up driving you away with her mediocrity." Brittany leaned closer to the phone, clearly unable to resist joining the cruelty. "Hi, Mrs. Anderson, I am Brittany from the firm. I just want to say, Gavin really has been carrying an unfair burden. It is honestly heartbreaking to watch him stress over finances while Melody contributes nothing to the household. He deserves to be happy and supported by someone who understands his potential." For a moment, I thought my mother might actually question why a random woman from Gavin's firm was intimately involved in this deeply personal phone call. I thought surely the undeniable presence of another woman would trigger some basic maternal instinct to defend her daughter from blatant infidelity. But my mother's toxic loyalty to status, success, and anyone who appeared wealthy blinded her completely. She would always align herself with the person who held the power. "Hello, Brittany," my mother replied warmly, completely validating the mistress without a second thought. "I am glad Gavin has supportive colleagues who recognize his immense value. It must be terribly difficult for him to come home to such a lifeless, uninspiring environment every single day. A successful man needs comfort and intelligent encouragement, not a dead weight holding him back from his true potential." I stood there absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washing over me. My own mother was actively validating the woman who had helped destroy my marriage. She was commiserating with my cheating husband, comforting him for the terrible burden of having to tolerate my presence. The scapegoat dynamic in my family had always been strong, but this was a masterclass in emotional abuse. They were feeding off each other, building a shared, delusional reality where my quiet nature and supposed lack of income justified every cruel and unfaithful action Gavin had taken. "I want her out of my house today." Beatrice, Gavin demanded, his voice hardening as he reasserted his dominance over the conversation. "I am giving her a 10-minute head start before I start tossing her cheap clothes onto the front lawn. She has no money and nowhere to go, so you better come get her before she becomes a public nuisance in my upscale neighborhood." "Fine," my mother snapped, her irritation directed entirely at me. "Keep her there. Do not let her take anything valuable from your home. I am leaving the country club right now. I will be there in 30 minutes to drag her back to the guest bedroom where she belongs. I will charge her rent until she finds a real job, maybe something in retail where she cannot just hide behind a computer screen all day pretending to work. She needs a harsh reality check." Gavin smiled brightly, his chest puffing out with pride. "Thank you, Beatrice. I appreciate your understanding and your reasonable approach to this mess. I am sorry it had to end this way, but I have to protect my own future. You deserve better, Gavin, my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Good luck with the promotion at the firm. We are all rooting for you. Gavin pressed the red button on his screen, ending the call. The silence rushed back into the hallway, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the study. He slipped the phone back into his tailored pocket and crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at me like a king observing a conquered peasant. Brittany mirrored his posture, her chin tilted up, waiting for my inevitable collapse. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for the desperate pleas for forgiveness, the frantic apologies, the absolute shattering of my spirit. They wanted me to fall to my knees on the hardwood floor and beg for a second chance, to promise I would change my ways, to ask for just a little more time, to find a place to live. Gavin thrived on power, and he had just used my own mother to strip away the very last piece of my perceived support system. He had isolated me completely, leaving me nowhere to run. But as I looked up at them, I felt no sorrow. I felt no grief for the end of a marriage that had clearly been a toxic sham for years. And I certainly felt no grief over the final definitive severing of the tie between myself and my mother. Instead, a profound and absolute clarity washed over my mind, cooling the blood in my veins. The years of hiding, of playing small to avoid their jealousy and relentless criticism, were officially over. They had demanded a victim to bully, but they had inadvertently awakened a predator they could not possibly comprehend. "Well," Gavin said, his voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper that echoed down the staircase, "it looks like nobody wants you, Melody. Your own mother cannot stand the sight of you. You are completely on your own now." I reached into the pocket of my practical denim jeans and pulled out my smartphone. It was a standard, unassuming model, exactly the kind of device a freelance data entry worker would use to check emails. I did not break eye contact with Gavin as I tapped the screen. The device required a complex biometric scan, recognizing my fingerprint, and immediately unlocking a hidden encrypted communication interface that Gavin had never seen and would not have recognized even if he had. "Who are you texting?" Brittany laughed, her voice sharp and grating in the quiet house. "Your mommy is already on her way to collect you. There is nobody else to call to save you from this." I ignored her entirely. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady and calm. I opened the direct channel to Wyatt, my chief operating officer, a man whose loyalty to me and efficiency in corporate warfare were absolute. I typed a single decisive command into the encrypted chat, knowing that these few words would set off a chain reaction that would obliterate their entire world. "Initiate Protocol Apex. Bring the fleet to the residence." I hit send and slipped the phone back into my pocket with a smooth, practiced motion. I then looked down at the scattered clothes on the stairs, my cheap vintage suitcase, and finally back up to the two people who foolishly believed they held my entire existence in their hands. "I am perfectly fine on my own, Gavin," I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet, unyielding authority that made his smug smile falter for just a fraction of a second. "Let us wait for my mother to arrive. I want her to be here to witness exactly what happens next." Gavin laughed, shaking his head. He turned his back, dismissing my presence entirely, and sauntered over to the custom wet bar in the corner of our expansive living room. He reached for a heavy crystal decanter, the glass clinking softly against the smooth marble countertop. In his mind, I was just a helpless woman throwing a pathetic tantrum to delay the inevitable reality of my eviction. Brittany followed him, her high heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She slipped her arm through his as he poured two generous glasses of expensive red wine. He handed her one, and they clinked their glasses together in a silent, mocking toast to my downfall. Gavin took a long sip of his wine, closing his eyes as if savoring the taste of sweet victory. "You really are living in a massive fantasy world," Melody, Gavin said. "You honestly think your mother is going to walk through that front door and suddenly take your side against me? You think she will see you clutching your cheap suitcase and have some grand maternal awakening? She is not coming here to save you. She is coming to make sure you do not embarrass her any further. She told me herself she has been waiting for the day I finally realized my own worth in the corporate world." I did not respond to his arrogant taunts. I simply walked over to the comfortable armchair near the front window and sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my hands folded neatly in my lap. I just needed to pass the time until the final pieces of my plan fell into place. Brittany took her glass of wine and wandered toward the center of the room, her eyes scanning the vaulted ceilings and minimalist decor. "It is such a crying shame," she murmured. "The architectural bones of this house are gorgeous, Gavin. But the interior design is incredibly depressing. It feels exactly like a waiting room at a very boring medical clinic. There is absolutely no unique personality here, no warmth, no modern sophistication. It is entirely lifeless." Gavin nodded in enthusiastic agreement. I know he sighed heavily. "I have been telling her for 6 years that we need to hire a professional decorator. But she always insisted on doing it herself to save pennies, acting like we are some struggling college couple. It has been a constant source of severe embarrassment for me when I host important clients from the firm. But do not worry, babe. Once she is permanently gone today, we can completely gut the whole first floor. We can bring in that luxury designer from New York you were telling me about. We finally have a clean slate to build our life together." Brittany smiled, her eyes lighting up with greed. "We could knock out that partition near the dining area to open up the space for entertaining. We could put in a modern stone fireplace, maybe some floor-to-ceiling windows for natural light. And we absolutely have to get rid of these dreadful drapes immediately. It is going to be so much fun turning this place into a real home, Gavin. A place where we can actually host proper dinner parties." I sat quietly listening to them, casually plan the total destruction of my carefully curated home. It was genuinely humorous to witness their arrogance. They were standing proudly in a house that belonged entirely to my corporate holding company, sipping wine that I had purchased, discussing exactly how they were going to spend Gavin's non-existent future bonus on massive renovations they would never be legally allowed to make. I focused on my slow breathing, keeping my facial expression perfectly placid and detached. Gavin noticed my silence and clearly mistook it for total defeat. He walked over to where I was sitting, looming over my chair to ensure I felt his physical dominance. He took another long sip of wine, looking down at me with a sickening mixture of pity and utter disgust. "You know, Melody, the absolute saddest part about you is how you never actually learned how the real world works. You sit in that little guest room all day, typing away on your computer, thinking that playing by the rules and staying quiet will somehow earn you respect. But true respect is bought. It is earned through raw power and financial leverage. Two essential things you have never possessed in your entire pathetic life." He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that made my skin crawl. "Let us talk about your beloved mother. You have always wondered why Beatrice worships the ground your brother walks on. You have always wondered why Mason can do absolutely no wrong, while you can do absolutely no right. You probably think it is just because he is the younger son she always wanted to show off, and because he performed the image of success she worshipped. But the ugly truth is much simpler. Your entire family is completely driven by money, Melody, and since you never had any real wealth to offer them, you simply never mattered to anyone." Brittany wandered over, standing just behind Gavin, a cruel smirk playing on her painted lips. She clearly knew the dark secret he was about to reveal. She swirled the wine in her glass, waiting for the devastating blow to land. "Mason is a total financial failure," Gavin said, laughing softly at the irony of his own words. "His massive cryptocurrency startup, that visionary tech company your mother is always bragging about to her wealthy country club friends, it went completely bankrupt 3 years ago. He lost absolutely everything. He leveraged his personal assets, took out terrible predatory loans, and crashed the entire operation into the ground. He was facing total financial ruin. Your precious, perfect younger brother was about to lose his luxury home, his cars, and his pristine reputation. And do you know exactly who stepped in to save him?" Gavin tapped his chest with an arrogant grin. "I did. I saved him from total destruction. Mason came crawling into my corporate office begging for a secret bailout, so your demanding mother would not find out he was a complete fraud. So over the last 3 years, I have been quietly funneling thousands into his checking accounts to keep his fake lifestyle afloat. I paid off his massive gambling debts. I covered the expensive lease on his sports car. I essentially funded the entire illusion of his ongoing success. And in return, he made absolutely sure your mother knew exactly who was keeping the family name pristine. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the scale of the betrayal unfolding before me. My brother was clearly dependent on Gavin's money, and Gavin had used that dependency to purchase loyalty inside my own family. I bought your family's loyalty with cold hard cash, Gavin boasted, his voice ringing with triumphant glee. I successfully purchased your mother's unconditional adoration. Every time Beatrice looks at me, she sees the man who saved her favorite child from public disgrace. That is why she hates you, Melody. She just sees a weak woman who contributes absolutely nothing to the family empire. She knows perfectly well that I hold the keys to Mason's survival. So when I called her today, she did not hesitate to side with me. She knows if she defends you, the secret money stops flowing and Mason's fake life comes crashing down. You have been entirely replaced in your own family by my impressive bank account. The living room fell silent as Gavin finished his arrogant revelation, waiting for me to break down into hysterical sobs. He expected me to cry out at the unfairness of it all, devastated that my husband had funded my brother's deceit to buy my mother's love. But I felt nothing but a cold, sharp anticipation. The trap was perfectly set, and they had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy them completely. I simply looked at him, my expression completely unreadable and perfectly calm, as the low crunching sound of heavy tires pulling onto the front gravel driveway outside suddenly broke the heavy silence of the house. Gavin turned toward the bay windows, his smug expression widening into a predatory grin as gravel crunched outside. He assumed my mother had arrived. Instead of opening the front door, he lingered in the center of the living room, swirling red wine in his crystal glass. He wanted his parting blows to land with maximum devastation. Brittany drifted toward the window, pulling back the drapes just enough to peer outside into the fading light. "It is just a delivery truck turning around," she announced, sounding disappointed. She walked back to Gavin, resting her manicured hand on his shoulder. "Looks like your mother is running a little late, Melody." Gavin chuckled, taking another slow sip of wine. He stepped closer to my chair, his polished shoes squeaking faintly against the hardwood floor. "You know, your mother and I had a long, honest conversation about you last week over lunch at the country club," he said. "She told me she always knew you would end up exactly like this. Sitting alone, contributing nothing to society, waiting for someone else to pay your bills." I remained seated, letting the profound reality of his financial betrayal wash over me. He had used his corporate salary to quietly pay off my brother Mason, effectively buying the maternal affection I had spent my entire life trying to earn. But I only felt a validating sense of closure. Every suspicion I ever held about my mother's sudden adoration for Gavin was now perfectly explained. "High as a visionary melody." Gavin continued pacing slowly to command my attention. "That is the exact word your own mother used to describe him. A visionary who just needs a little financial runway to change the world. And you, do you want to know what she called you?" I did not answer him. I kept my gaze fixed steadily on his face, my breathing perfectly even. My refusal to engage, my absolute lack of tears, only fueled his desperate need to assert his dominance. He leaned down, placing his hands heavily on the armrests of my chair, trapping me in his personal space. "She called you a glorified typist." Gavin spat his eyes wide with malicious glee. "You sit in that spare room pushing buttons on a keyboard, making a few $100s a week, while the real adults are out running the global economy. Do you have any concept of the magnitude of wealth I am about to control?" He stood up straight again, throwing his arms wide as if to encompass the entire house. "Next month, when my promotion to senior vice president at Vanguard Financial becomes official, my base salary alone will quadruple. My year-end bonus will be more money than you could ever hope to see in 3 lifetimes of your pathetic freelance work. Brittany and I are going to be traveling to Paris and buying a summer home." Brittany smiled warmly, clearly picturing the luxurious life Gavin was promising her. "It is going to be incredibly demanding, Gavin," she murmured, playing the supportive corporate partner flawlessly. "But with your new executive authority at the firm, we will be completely unstoppable in the financial district." "That is what a real partnership looks like," Melody, Gavin declared, pointing a finger at my face. "A shared vision, a mutual understanding of high-level corporate strategy." When I am sitting in executive board meetings negotiating multi-million-dollar acquisitions, I need a woman who can hold her own in the room. You were dragging my reputation down into the dirt. Everyone at the firm knew I was carrying dead weight. It was embarrassing to introduce you to my superiors. I had to constantly make up excuses for why my wife had no career ambitions. He paused, clearly waiting for me to crack. He wanted me to argue with him. He wanted me to defend my honor, to scream that I was smart, to beg him to recognize my worth. That was the dynamic he fed on. He loved to tear me down just to watch me desperately try to build myself back up. But I gave him absolutely nothing. Instead, I slowly lifted my left arm and checked my watch. It was a simple, understated timepiece, completely devoid of diamonds or flashy branding. I checked the dial, noting the exact minute, and then let my hand fall back into my lap. I looked past him, staring calmly ahead. Gavin's face flushed a deep, angry red. The vein in his neck throbbed as his frustration finally boiled over. My calm indifference was the one reaction he had not prepared for, and it was driving him absolutely insane. "Are you even listening to me?" Gavin shouted, taking a sudden aggressive step forward. He slammed his hand down onto the wooden side table next to my chair, making the decorative lamp rattle. "Look at me when I'm talking to you. You sit there acting like you do not care that your entire life is completely falling apart. But you are going to care a whole lot when you are sleeping in your mother's guest bedroom and eating cheap canned soup." Brittany took a slight step back, momentarily startled by the sudden volume of his voice. "Kevin, honey, calm down," she said softly, placing a cautious hand on his arm. "Do not let her get to you. She is just in denial." "I am perfectly calm," Gavin snapped, shaking off her hand. His eyes locked furiously on mine. "I just want her to understand the reality of her situation. You are 34 years old, Melody. You have no savings, no professional network, and no future. When Vanguard Financial announces my promotion, my name will be in the business journals. I will be recognized as a top-tier executive in the industry, and you will be absolutely nobody. You will be begging me for scraps by next week. You will be calling my assistant begging for a tiny sliver of alimony just to survive." I continued to sit in silence, my heart beating with a steady rhythmic calm. The irony of his screaming at me about Vanguard Financial was almost too beautiful to bear. He was chest-pounding about his impending promotion at a company that at this exact moment was undergoing a massive hostile restructuring orchestrated by the very woman sitting quietly in his living room. "You really have everything completely figured out, Gavin," I said softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "It is genuinely impressive how much faith you have in your own corporate trajectory. I am sure Vanguard Financial will reward your loyalty exactly the way you deserve." He sneered, interpreting my words as a pathetic, defeated concession. Finally, he muttered, turning away from me in disgust. "Finally, you admit it. You are right, they will reward me. Because I bring actual value to the table. I generate real revenue. I do not just sit around taking up space and breathing other people's air." He walked back over to Brittany, wrapping his arms securely around her slender waist and pulling her close against his side. He kissed the top of her blonde head, making a grand theatrical show of his new affection. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining with absolute adoration and shared malice. They were the perfect toxic portrait of corporate arrogance. I looked away from them, directing my gaze back toward the large front windows. The sky outside was beginning to darken, casting long dramatic shadows across the manicured front lawn. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to grow louder, marking the final seconds of their ignorant bliss. They thought my silence was the silence of a broken, defeated woman accepting her dismal fate. They had absolutely no idea it was simply the cold, quiet patience of a seasoned hunter, watching her prey walk willingly into a carefully constructed trap. I did not need to scream or argue. I just needed to patiently wait for my mother to arrive so the real show could finally begin. I was perfectly content letting them believe their cruel and twisted delusion for just a tiny bit longer, knowing the exact moment their entire false empire would collapse. The crunch of gravel outside grew louder, followed by the distinctive heavy hum of a high-end engine shutting off in the driveway. Through the sheer cream-colored curtains of the front bay window, I watched the headlights of a sleek silver luxury sedan cut through the gathering dusk before suddenly fading to black. It was a leased Mercedes-Benz, a shiny status symbol my mother Beatrice paraded around her exclusive country club as undeniable proof of her enduring elegance and wealth. I knew the exact terms of that lease intimately, of course. I knew the specific day she proudly drove it off the dealership lot, and I knew the exact dollar amount Gavin had quietly contributed to her down payment just to keep her suitably impressed with his financial prowess. Gavin stood up a little straighter, using both hands to smooth the crisp lapels of his expensive charcoal suit. He walked toward the front hallway, with the eager, restless anticipation of a man waiting for an audience to arrive and applaud his cruelty. Brittany trailed just a single step behind him, her posture practically radiating a desperate, hungry need for maternal validation from the woman she was hoping to replace me with. The heavy oak front door swung open with a soft click. Beatrice stepped into the brightly lit foyer, bringing a wave of overpowering, expensive floral perfume and the sharp chill of the evening air into the house. She was dressed impeccably, wearing a flawlessly tailored cream pantsuit and a vintage string of pearls that had been in our family for generations. Her blonde hair, meticulously coiffed and color-treated to hide any trace of gray, caught the warm glow of the entryway chandelier. She did not look at me, not even a passing accidental glance. Instead, she walked right past the armchair, where I sat, the brisk, aggressive tapping of her designer heels echoing sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She headed straight for Gavin, throwing her arms open wide in a grand, dramatic display of deep affection. "Oh, Gavin, my dear," Beatrice sighed, pulling him into a tight, lingering embrace. "I came over as quickly as I could the moment we hung up. I am just so terribly sorry you have to endure this awful mess. It must be so exhausting for you." Gavin hugged her back, leaning into the embrace and playing the role of the exhausted, long-suffering victim to absolute perfection. "Thank you so much for coming, Beatrice," he murmured, his voice thick with a heavy, manufactured sorrow. "It has been an incredibly draining day. I just did not know who else to call." I sat in my chair, my hands still folded quietly and neatly in my lap, watching my own mother physically and emotionally comfort the man who had just gleefully destroyed my marriage. There was no hesitation in her actions, no maternal instinct prompting her to check on her daughter's well-being. She had walked past me as if I were nothing more than a discarded, invisible piece of furniture, a shameful stain on the otherwise pristine aesthetic of her perfectly curated life. Beatrice slowly pulled back from Gavin and turned her undivided attention to the young woman standing faithfully by his side. Brittany offered a polite, practiced smile, stepping forward slightly into the light. "Beatrice, this is Brittany," Gavin introduced her, his tone instantly shifting from tired victimhood to beaming pride. "She is a brilliant junior executive at my firm. She has been an incredible source of emotional support for me through all of this recent turmoil." Beatrice's sharp eyes swept over Brittany, taking in the tight crimson dress, the expensive handbag clutched in her hand, and the perfectly styled blonde waves. Instead of expressing even a fraction of disgust at her son-in-law openly parading his much younger mistress in front of her, Beatrice's face lit up with genuine radiant approval. "It is an absolute pleasure to meet you, Brittany," my mother said, reaching out eagerly to grasp the younger woman's hands. "That dress is simply stunning on you. You have such wonderful taste. It is so incredibly refreshing to see a woman who actually puts real effort into her appearance and understands exactly how to present herself alongside a highly successful man." "Thank you so much, Mrs. Anderson." Brittany beamed, her voice dripping with a cloying, artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Gavin has told me such wonderful things about you. I admire your grace and your style so much." Beatrice let out a delighted, musical little laugh, completely charmed by the blatant flattery. "Please, you must call me Beatrice," she insisted, squeezing Brittany's hands. "Any friend of Gavin is a dear friend of mine. He truly deserves to be surrounded by people who lift him up and recognize his immense value." The sheer audacity of the exchange was breathtaking to witness. My mother was openly and joyfully welcoming the woman who had actively helped dismantle my life, complimenting her fashion choices, while standing less than 10 feet away from her own daughter. It was the ultimate, irrefutable confirmation of everything I had always known deep down in my bones. Beatrice did not care about family loyalty, basic morality, or unconditional love. She only cared about aligning herself with people who could provide her with the shiny illusion of power, status, and financial security. Finally, Beatrice turned slowly on her heels to face me. The warm, inviting smile she had just bestowed upon Brittany vanished instantly, replaced by a deep, familiar scowl of pure, unadulterated disappointment. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, looking down her nose at me with an expression of intense revulsion. "Look at you!" Beatrice sneered, her voice dropping into the harsh, critical tone that had scored the miserable soundtrack of my entire childhood. "Just sitting there in your plain denim jeans and that awful oversized sweater like a sullen, petulant teenager. Do you have any idea how deeply embarrassing you are, Melody? Gavin is on the very verge of becoming a senior vice president at a major financial institution, and you cannot even be bothered to brush your hair properly or put on a decent pair of shoes." I met her angry gaze, evenly refusing to give her the satisfaction of looking away or shrinking under her judgment. I did not say a single word, which only seemed to fuel the burning fire of her indignation. "You have always been completely inadequate," Beatrice continued, taking a menacing step closer to my chair and pointing a manicured, accusing finger directly at my face. "From the time you were a little girl, you severely lacked any sense of ambition or class. You never cared about networking with the right families, you never cared about presenting a polished image to the world, and you clearly never cared about being a supportive traditional wife. I told you years ago that if you did not put in the effort to keep a wealthy man like Gavin happy, someone else would gladly step up and take your place. And look exactly what happened. You brought this humiliation entirely on yourself." Gavin nodded solemnly, slipping his arm back around Brittany's waist to proudly reinforce the visual of their united front. "I tried, Beatrice," he said softly, playing the wounded martyr yet again. "I really tried to bring her into my corporate world, but she just wanted to hide in the guest room and play with her little spreadsheets. She completely checked out of this marriage and left me to carry the entire load." "She checked out of reality." Beatrice snapped, her eyes narrowing into cold slits as she glared at me. "You have always lived in this pathetic little bubble of mediocrity, Melody. You actually think the world owes you something just for existing. You contribute absolutely nothing to society, and you bring nothing but shame and embarrassment to our family name." Beatrice began to pace the hardwood floor in front of me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the wood. She was working herself up into a grand theatrical rage, performing for Gavin and Brittany to prove her unwavering loyalty to their side of the conflict. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before, always leading to the exact same miserable destination. "Why could you not just be more like your brother?" Beatrice demanded, throwing her hands up in dramatic exasperation. "Mason is a true visionary. He has incredible, unstoppable drive. He is out there right now, building a massive technology empire, securing huge rounds of funding, and making a real respected name for himself in the business world. He understands exactly what it takes to achieve greatness. He is constantly hustling, constantly innovating, constantly pushing himself to the absolute limit. And you are nothing but a glorified typist clinging desperately to the coattails of a man who is destined for things you cannot even begin to comprehend." The rich irony of her praising Mason's non-existent empire almost made me smile. She was standing inside a financial reality she had never bothered to question, aggressively defending a man who had covertly paid off her favorite son's gambling debts while lecturing me about ambition and gratitude. Her certainty was impressive. She had mistaken appearances for facts for so long that she no longer knew the difference. "You should be down on your knees thanking Gavin for allowing you to live in this beautiful home for the past 6 years. Beatrice spat, her voice growing louder and more vicious with every word. "He gave you a life of luxury and total comfort, and you repaid him with absolute laziness and ingratitude. You are a profound disappointment to me, Melody. You always have been. And quite frankly, I am incredibly relieved that Gavin is finally cutting you loose so he can reach his full potential without you dragging him down into the mud." She stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, leaning down until her face was only inches from mine. The suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me. She wanted to break me right then and there. She wanted to see the tears well up in my eyes and spill over my cheeks. She wanted me to apologize, to cry, and to beg for her maternal forgiveness. She wanted the absolute unconditional submission she had demanded from me since I was a child. But I remained perfectly unnervingly still. I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes, and I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation. The last tiny fraying thread of daughterly obligation I had ever felt towards this woman snapped silently in the air between us. The complete lack of maternal instinct she had just displayed solidified the ultimate betrayal, hardening my heart completely. There would be no mercy tonight. Not for Gavin, not for Brittany, and certainly not for the mother who had just eagerly sold her own daughter out for the illusion of country club status. The heavy silence that followed my mother's brutal monologue was finally broken by the sharp sound of a brass zipper. Gavin had walked over to the entryway console table where he had carelessly dropped his sleek leather briefcase earlier that afternoon. He opened it with a swift, practiced motion, his broad shoulders squared with an unmistakable sense of corporate purpose. I watched him reach inside and pull out a thick manila folder. He held it in his hands for a brief second, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the heavy cardstock, before he turned and strode purposefully back toward the center of the living room. His expensive shoes made that same confident squeaking sound against the hardwood floor. He was moving in for the kill, absolutely certain that my mother's vicious verbal assault had perfectly primed me for total surrender. He walked directly to the large glass coffee table that sat between my armchair and the main sofa. With a dramatic sweeping gesture, he tossed the folder onto the smooth glass surface. It landed with a heavy, definitive slap that seemed to echo off the vaulted ceilings. The folder slid a few inches before coming to a complete stop directly in front of me. Brittany leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with undisguised excitement, eager to witness the final legal severing of my life from the man she desperately wanted to claim as her own prize. I looked down at the manila folder. The top flap was slightly open, revealing a stack of crisp white paper covered in dense, intimidating legal jargon. It was a pre-drafted divorce settlement. Gavin must have had his expensive corporate attorneys working on this document for weeks, quietly preparing the legal trap while I was allegedly sitting in the guest room doing nothing. He had meticulously planned every single detail of my financial execution long before he ever brought Brittany into my home to flaunt his infidelity. "Go ahead and open it, Melody," Gavin commanded, his voice dripping with artificial magnanimity. He crossed his arms over his chest again, puffing himself up to look as large and intimidating as possible. "I want you to read it carefully, but I will save you the trouble of trying to decipher the complex legal terms. I am an incredibly reasonable man, and despite the absolute misery you have put me through over the last 6 years, I have decided to be generous." I slowly reached out and flipped the manila cover open. The bold black letters at the top of the page glared up at me, officially petitioning the dissolution of our marriage. I did not bother reading the dense paragraphs below. I simply kept my eyes fixed on the paper, waiting for him to deliver his carefully rehearsed pitch. "You will notice on the third page that there is a specific clause regarding spousal support." Gavin continued, taking a slow, arrogant step around the coffee table, so he was standing just inches from my knees. "I have instructed my legal team to draft an ironclad waiver of alimony. You will not be entitled to a single cent of my future earnings. You will not touch my Vanguard financial salary. You will have absolutely no claim to my upcoming executive bonuses. And you will surrender any rights to my retirement portfolios. You are walking away from my wealth completely." He paused, clearly waiting for me to gasp or cry out in financial terror. When I remained perfectly still, he let out a short, condescending sigh. "However, because I am a good person, and because I know you have absolutely zero savings of your own, I have included a one-time severance payment. If you sign that document today, right here and right now, without causing any legal drama or forcing me to drag you into a courtroom, I will write you a personal check for exactly $10,000. Brittany let out a soft, impressed gasp, playing her part in the theatrical performance flawlessly. "Oh, Gavin, that is so incredibly generous of you," she murmured, placing a hand over her heart. "You really are too kind to her after everything she has done to hold you back. $10,000 is more than enough for her to start over somewhere else." Gavin smiled at her praise, then looked back down at me. $10,000, Melody. That is a massive amount of money for someone who makes pennies formatting spreadsheets. It is more than enough for you to rent a cheap apartment in a lower-income neighborhood and buy yourself some basic groceries while you look for a minimum wage job. But you only get that money if you sign the papers immediately. If you decide to be difficult. Gavin warned, his voice suddenly dropping into a harsh, threatening register. If you try to hire some bargain bin lawyer to fight me for my assets, I will make your life a living nightmare. I have kept meticulous track of every single household expense since the day we got married. I know exactly how much of my hard-earned money went toward paying for your food, your utilities, and the roof over your head. You have essentially been a financial parasite feeding off my corporate success. He leaned down slowly, resting his heavy hands on the edge of the glass coffee table, bringing his extremely flushed, angry face, completely level with mine, to force direct eye contact. If you do not sign that waiver right now, I will counter-sue you for restitution. I will take you to court and demand repayment for every single grocery bill I funded over the last 6 years. I will calculate the cost of every meal you ate, every light bulb you turned on, and every drop of water you used in my house. By the time my lawyers are finished with you, you will owe me hundreds of thousands of dollars. You will be buried in so much debt you will never be able to open a basic checking account again. Do you understand me? I am giving you the easiest way out. Take the $10,000 and disappear quietly, or I will legally destroy whatever tiny fraction of a life you have left. My mother stepped forward, her expensive perfume washing over me again as she invaded my personal space. She looked down at the divorce settlement on the glass table with an expression of intense approval. Gavin is offering you a golden parachute, Melody, Beatrice said sharply, her tone leaving absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. He is being far more gracious than you actually deserve. Any other man would have simply thrown you out into the street with nothing but the cheap clothes on your back. You should be down on your knees thanking him for this incredible charity. She reached into her sleek designer handbag and pulled out an elegant, heavy silver pen. She gripped it tightly in her perfectly manicured fingers, examining the tip for a brief moment before slamming it down violently onto the glass table right on top of the divorce settlement. The sharp, sudden clatter of heavy metal against the thick glass made Brittany jump slightly in surprise, but I did not even blink. "Pick up that expensive pen and sign those legal papers right now," my mother demanded, pointing her finger at the document. "I will not allow you to drag this family through a messy legal battle just because you are too lazy to support yourself. You have caused enough embarrassment for one lifetime. You are going to sign away your rights to Gavin's money, and then you are going to pick up your suitcase and get in my car. I will drive you back to my house, and you will stay in the guest bedroom until you figure out how to function like a normal adult. You will pay me monthly rent, and you will follow my rules. Do not test my patience today, Melody. Sign the papers and get in the car before I change my mind and leave you here to rot." I stared at her, absorbing the absolute depth of her betrayal, knowing my silence was the only response she was going to get. The silver pen lay on the glass coffee table, catching the fading evening light. Gavin shifted his weight, crossing his arms tighter. My mother stood completely rigid near the sofa, her foot tapping impatiently against the floor, ready to escort her failure of a daughter out the door. I very slowly extended my right hand toward the glass table. I finally picked up the heavy silver pen. I saw Gavin drop his shoulders slightly, assuming he had finally won the psychological battle. I saw my mother let out a small, satisfied huff of air, pleased that her harsh discipline had brought me back to my senses. But I deliberately did not remove the cap. I simply did not move the pen toward the signature line at the bottom of the predatory document. I simply opened my hand and let the pen drop. It hit the thick glass of the coffee table with a loud, sharp, echoing clatter that shattered the heavy silence of the living room. The first true shift in power rippled through the room like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The triumphant smirk on Gavin's face vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden scowl of deep confusion and rising anger. He uncrossed his arms, taking a heavy, aggressive step forward. "What exactly do you think you are doing right now, Melody?" Gavin demanded, his voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, threatening register. "I told you to pick up the pen and sign the papers." My mother stepped forward immediately, her face flushing with renewed indignation. "Pick up that pen right now," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at the glass table. You are completely out of options, and you are out of time. I did not look at the scattered legal papers, and I did not look at Gavin. I directed my gaze entirely to my mother. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive cream pantsuit suddenly looked like a cheap, desperate costume worn by a foolish woman. "Beatrice," I said softly, my voice remaining perfectly calm and completely steady. "Are you absolutely sure you want to align yourself with a man who is about to face federal prison?" The question hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a long, tense moment, nobody in the living room spoke a single word. The sheer absurdity of my statement from their incredibly arrogant perspective seemed to short-circuit their brains. Then my mother let out a loud, mocking laugh that bounced sharply off the vaulted ceilings. It was a harsh, brittle sound completely devoid of any genuine humor or warmth. "Federal prison," Beatrice repeated, shaking her head in dramatic disbelief, as if I had just declared the sky was falling. "You have completely lost your mind, Melody. You are absolutely delusional. This is exactly what happens when you spend years hiding in a guest bedroom doing absolutely nothing with your life. Your brain simply turns to mush. You are having a pathetic mental breakdown right in front of us because you cannot handle the harsh reality of your failures." Brittany let out a high-pitched giggle, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh my goodness," she murmured, looking up at Gavin with wide, amused eyes. "She really is completely unstable. Gavin, you were so right to get away from her. This is actually sad to watch her unravel like this." Gavin ran a hand through his styled hair, letting out a heavy sigh of theatrical exhaustion. "Listen to yourself, Melody," he said, shaking his head in mock pity. "You are making completely baseless psychotic threats because you are desperate and cornered. Federal prison. I am a highly respected financial executive. I am about to be named a senior vice president at Vanguard Financial. I manage multi-million-dollar portfolios for some of the wealthiest clients in this entire city. You are a freelance data entry clerk who cannot even afford to buy her own groceries without my debit card. Do you really think anyone is going to listen to your insane, desperate lies?" I did not break eye contact with my mother, choosing to ignore Gavin and his mistress entirely for the moment. "I am not having a mental breakdown, Beatrice," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level and utterly unbothered by their childish insults. "I am asking you a very serious practical question. You have always prided yourself on being socially intelligent and financially cautious. You have spent your entire life calculating the financial value of the people around you. So I am asking you to look very closely at the man standing next to you and ask yourself if you truly want to be caught in his devastating blast radius when his entire world explodes." My mother crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her eyes narrowing into angry, hostile slits. "I am not going to stand here and listen to your ridiculous fairy tales," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Gavin has been nothing but generous to our family. He has been incredibly supportive of your brother Mason, and he has provided you with a beautiful luxury home that you completely took for granted. The only person whose world is exploding today is yours, Melody. Now pick up that pen, sign the alimony waiver, and accept the $10,000 before he takes that generous offer off the table and leaves you with absolutely nothing." I finally shifted my gaze from my mother back to Gavin. He was standing tall, his chest puffed out, waiting for me to crack under the combined weight of their coordinated intimidation. He genuinely believed that his pre-drafted divorce settlement was a masterstroke of legal genius. He truly believed he held all the cards and dictated all the rules. "I am not signing your divorce settlement, Gavin," I said, my tone as casual as if we were discussing the evening weather forecast. "I am not signing the alimony waiver, and I am certainly not taking your pathetic $10,000 severance check." Gavin took another aggressive step toward my chair, leaning down to intimidate me with his overbearing physical presence. "You are making the biggest mistake of your entire miserable life," he growled, his face turning a deep, angry shade of crimson. "If you do not sign those papers today, I will drag you through the mud. I will tie you up in expensive civil court for years. I will sue you for restitution, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your pathetic life paying me back for every single cent I wasted keeping you alive. You will have nothing." I smiled then. It was a small, quiet smile, but it contained the full, heavy weight of a secret I had guarded fiercely for 6 long years. It was the calm, knowing smile of a woman who knew exactly how the story was going to end. "I do not need a single cent of your money, Gavin," I said, my voice ringing with a quiet, undeniable authority that finally made his aggressive posture falter just a fraction. "I do not need your $10,000 to start over, and I do not need your alimony to survive. I am not going to fight you for a tiny fraction of your corporate salary or a meaningless piece of your precious retirement portfolio. You can keep every single penny you have ever earned at Vanguard Financial." Gavin blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my complete lack of financial desperation. His brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. "If you think you are going to get half the value of this house, you are even more stupid than I thought," he shot back, trying desperately to regain control of the shifting narrative. "My lawyers will prove that you contributed absolutely nothing to the mortgage payments over the last 6 years. You have no legal claim to this property." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows gently on my knees, maintaining perfect eye contact with the man who treated me like a worthless burden. "I am not going to fight you for this house, Gavin," I said softly, enunciating every single word with cold, deliberate precision. "Because I already own everything you think is yours." Gavin opened his mouth to unleash what would have undoubtedly been a blistering, condescending tirade. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He was preparing to tear into my sanity, to mock my declaration as the desperate, pathetic delusion of a broken woman grasping at invisible straws. My mother had actually taken a deep breath, her chest rising as she prepared to join the verbal assault, fully intending to scream that I needed immediate psychiatric hospitalization. But the harsh, cruel words died instantly in their throats, before a single sound could escape either of them. A deep, resonant rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the expansive living room. It was not the casual, everyday sound of a delivery truck or a passing neighbor returning from work. It was a heavy, synchronized mechanical growl that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the house. The crystal wine glasses resting on the custom wet bar trembled slightly against the smooth marble countertop. The sheer, cream-colored drapes, framing the large front bay windows, suddenly illuminated with the blinding, brilliant glare of multiple high-beam headlights, piercing through the gathering darkness of the quiet suburban evening. The blinding light swept across the living room in sharp, aggressive arcs, casting long, distorted shadows of Gavin Brittany and my mother against the pale walls. The overwhelming mechanical purr of high-performance engines settled directly outside our front door. Gavin froze in place, his mouth still hanging half open in suspended outrage. Brittany instinctively took a frightened step backward, her manicured hands flying up to grasp Gavin's tailored arm for protection. My mother whipped her head toward the front window, her expression of arrogant indignation instantly melting into one of profound, paralyzed confusion. Nobody moved a muscle. The oppressive silence inside the living room was deafening, broken only by the synchronized hum of heavy machinery idling just a few yards away. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Gavin unglued his expensive leather shoes from the hardwood floor and took a cautious, hesitant step toward the bay window. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the sheer curtain back just an inch, squinting against the harsh glare of the headlights. Brittany crowded in closely behind him, peering over his tense shoulder, her eyes widening in absolute shock. My mother followed suit, practically pressing her face against the cold glass to see what was causing the massive disruption on the street. I did not need to look outside. I remained perfectly still in my armchair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching their faces contort with dawning terror. Sitting parked in the long driveway, completely dominating the space and aggressively boxing in my mother's leased silver Mercedes-Benz, were 5 identical, pristine black luxury SUVs. They were massive, imposing armored vehicles with deeply tinted windows that revealed absolutely nothing of the occupants sitting inside. They were parked in a flawless, mathematically precise convoy, the heavy engines purring in perfect, intimidating unison. The sheer physical presence of the fleet was overwhelming, turning our quiet, upper-middle-class suburban street into what looked like a highly secured federal staging ground. "What in the world is happening out there?" my mother whispered, her voice trembling, completely stripped of all its previous haughty authority. "Gavin, who are these people? Did you call someone to come here today?" Gavin shook his head slowly, his face completely drained of color. I have no idea, he stammered, his confident corporate persona evaporating into thin air. I did not call anyone. Maybe it is a mistake. Maybe they have the wrong address. I was desperately trying to rationalize the terrifying situation, clinging to the fragile hope that this massive display of wealth and power was simply a logistical error. He could not fathom a reality where this kind of force was deliberately directed at our house. But his fragile rationalization shattered a moment later. With a sharp synchronized clack that echoed clearly through the evening air, the heavy doors of the 5 SUVs swung open simultaneously. The interior cabin lights clicked on, casting a cool, clinical white glow onto the gravel driveway. From the dark depths of the blacked-out vehicles, 12 men and women stepped out into the chilly evening air. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. There was no casual chatter, no shuffling of feet, no hesitation. They moved like a highly trained elite military unit, but they were dressed for brutal corporate warfare. Each of the 12 individuals wore impeccably tailored high-end business suits. The men wore dark, sharp fabrics with crisp white shirts and silk ties. The women were dressed in razor-sharp executive wear, carrying sleek briefcases and encrypted digital tablets. They fanned out across the driveway and the front lawn in perfect unison, their expressions completely stoic and entirely unreadable. 4 of the men, clearly a private security detail, immediately took up strategic positions around the perimeter of the property, their hands resting near their waists. They stumbled back from the window, his breath hitching painfully in his throat. His hands dropped limply to his sides, his arrogant posture completely crumbling under the weight of the unknown threat. Brittany let out a soft, terrified whimper, shrinking further behind his broad back. They were entirely out of their depth, staring blindly at a level of coordinated corporate intimidation they had only ever seen in movies. My mother clutched her vintage string of pearls tightly, her knuckles turning bone white, as she struggled to comprehend the impossible scene unfolding on the manicured front lawn. From the lead SUV parked closest to the front door, a final figure emerged. It was Wyatt. He stepped out of the vehicle with a smooth, effortless grace that commanded instant respect. He was 40 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a sharp, intimidating physical presence that made the cold air around him seem to crackle with tension. He was wearing a bespoke midnight blue suit that cost more than Gavin's entire monthly salary, and he held a sleek, brushed titanium briefcase firmly in his left hand. Wyatt did not look around at the neighborhood. He did not check his surroundings. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He buttoned his suit jacket with his free right hand, his face set in an expression of icy, uncompromising authority, and began to walk purposefully up the paved walkway toward the front door. 2 members of his security detail immediately fell into step, just a few feet behind him, forming a tight, impenetrable protective wedge. "He is coming to the door!" Brittany gasped, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Gavin, do something. Lock the door right now. Call the police. They are coming right up to the house." Gavin was completely frozen. The man who had spent the last hour screaming in my face, bragging loudly about his impending promotion and his untouchable power, was now absolutely paralyzed by the sight of a real executive walking up his driveway. He did not move to lock the front door. He did not reach for his smartphone. He just stared in horrified fascination as the heavy footsteps echoed loudly on the front porch. I remained comfortably in my armchair, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my entire body. The waiting was finally over. The invisible shield I had worn for 6 long years was coming down, and the true weight of my reality was walking right through the front door. There was no knock. There was no polite ringing of the doorbell. The heavy oak front door simply swung open with a smooth, heavy creak. Wyatt pushed it open effortlessly, stepping over the threshold and into the brightly lit foyer without a single ounce of hesitation. He brought the cold air inside. 2 guards stepped directly behind him, flanking the entrance. Wyatt stood still, his calculating eyes sweeping the room. He saw Gavin trembling, Brittany cowering, and my mother staring in shock. He completely ignored them, walking straight to me and bowing his head slightly. The heavy silence in the room stretched into something almost physical as Wyatt straightened his posture. He stood before my armchair with absolute discipline and unwavering focus that demanded instant compliance. His dark suit was immaculate down to the smallest detail, and his presence seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The two security guards who had followed him inside stepped forward with quiet efficiency. They did not speak a single word, but their actions were perfectly coordinated. One guard positioned himself near the front door, blocking any potential exit, while the second guard moved to the edge of the living room, establishing a clear line of sight across the entire open floor plan. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, their faces carved from stone. Gavin finally managed to draw a ragged breath. The sheer shock of the intrusion had temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords, but his fragile corporate ego could not allow another man to completely dominate his living space without a fight. He took a hesitant step away from the bay window, his expensive shoes scraping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. "Excuse me!" Gavin demanded, his voice cracking slightly, before forcing it into a louder, aggressive register. "Who do you think you are? You cannot just barge into my home. I am going to call the police right now and have you arrested for trespassing. This is private property, and I demand that you leave immediately." Wyatt did not even turn his head to look at him. It was a masterclass in professional indifference. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on me, treating Gavin with the same level of concern one might give to a buzzing fly against a window pane. Every aspect of his training was designed to neutralize chaotic elements without breaking protocol. This complete lack of acknowledgement infuriated Gavin far more than any verbal insult could have. The man who was supposedly days away from becoming a senior vice president was being treated as completely irrelevant in his own living room. It was an ego-shattering realization that he was entirely outmatched by a force he could not comprehend. "Hey," Gavin shouted, taking another step forward, his face flushing with a mixture of profound embarrassment and rising panic. "I am talking to you. Get out of my house." The security guard positioned near the edge of the living room shifted his weight just a fraction of an inch. He did not draw a weapon or make a sudden movement, but he angled his broad shoulders directly toward Gavin. The subtle physical warning was incredibly clear. Gavin stopped dead in his tracks, his bravado evaporating the moment he realized these men were not intimidated by his loud voice or his tailored suit. He swallowed hard, taking a slow, cautious step backward until his back hit the edge of the custom wet bar. My mother, who had been clutching her pearls in a state of absolute shock, suddenly found her voice. She was accustomed to wielding immense social power in her wealthy suburban circles, and she genuinely believed her status could shield her from any uncomfortable reality. She puffed out her chest and marched toward the center of the room, her designer heels clicking sharply. "This is entirely unacceptable," Beatrice announced, using her sharpest, most commanding country club tone. "I do not know what kind of stunt you are pulling, Melody, but you need to call off these actors right now. You are causing a massive public disturbance. My son-in-law is a highly respected financial executive, and you are putting his entire career in jeopardy with this ridiculous theatrical display. I want all of you out of this house before I call the neighborhood security patrol myself." Wyatt slowly turned his head to look at my mother. He did not say a word. He simply leveled a stare of such freezing, profound emptiness at her that Beatrice stopped mid-stride. The haughty, indignant expression on her face melted into raw, unadulterated fear. She had spent her entire life bullying people who were financially or emotionally vulnerable, but she had never stood face to face with true, uncompromising corporate power. Wyatt did not need to raise his voice to command respect. His silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with absolute perfection. Beatrice shrank back, her shoulders slumping, as she retreated to the safety of the sofa, unable to maintain eye contact with the towering man in the midnight blue suit. All of her country club bravado vanished completely into thin air. She suddenly looked incredibly small and entirely insignificant, sinking into the plush cushions, as if trying to physically hide from the crushing weight of her own foolish mistakes. She clutched her handbag against her chest, desperately searching for any familiar sense of control that had long since evaporated from the premises. Brittany was trembling near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, smug mistress who had mocked my clothing just 20 minutes earlier. She was entirely out of her depth, trapped in a high-stakes situation she could not possibly comprehend. She looked at Gavin for reassurance, but Gavin was too busy staring in terror at the security guards to even notice her distress. They were both learning a very harsh lesson about the true nature of power. I remained seated in my armchair, observing the rapid, complete dismantling of their artificial hierarchy. For 6 years, I had allowed Gavin to dictate the terms of our existence. For my entire life, I had allowed my mother to measure my worth against my brother Mason. They had built their entire identities on the false premise that I was a weak, dependent failure. Now the very foundation of their reality was crumbling right in front of their eyes, and I was enjoying every single second of their profound confusion. Wyatt reached forward with his left hand, presenting the sleek, brushed titanium briefcase he had carried from the lead vehicle. He held it out with both hands, offering it to me with the utmost reverence. Madam CEO Wyatt announced, his deep voice carrying a crisp, ringing authority that sliced through the tension like a freshly sharpened blade. The hostile acquisition is now completely finalized. Our legal team has secured all necessary regulatory approvals. The board of directors is standing by on a secure line, eagerly waiting for your final signature to execute the transfer of assets. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Madam CEO. It was a title I had held for years, a title whispered in highly secure boardrooms and encrypted digital meetings. But hearing it spoken aloud in the center of my suburban living room felt incredibly surreal. Gavin let out a sharp, breathless sound, something halfway between a scoff and a gasp of raw panic. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the hardwood floor. His brain was visibly short-circuiting, desperately trying to process the impossible information his ears had just received. The man who had spent the last 6 years treating me like a burdensome, useless dependent was now staring at an elite corporate operative treating me like royalty. "What kind of sick, pathetic joke is this?" Gavin stammered, his voice cracking violently as he pointed a shaking finger at Wyatt. "Who are you people? Did you hire a bunch of amateur actors to come in here and pretend you are some kind of boss melody? This is insane. You are having a complete psychological breakdown. I am calling the authorities right now." He reached into his pocket for his smartphone, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped the device on the floor. Brittany shrank further behind him, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest, like a protective shield, realizing far too late that she had happily walked into a devastatingly dangerous trap. My mother, Beatrice, found her voice, though it lacked all of its previous haughty authority. She clutched her vintage string of pearls, her knuckles turning bone white. "Melody, this has gone far enough," Beatrice squeaked, her voice thin and reedy. "Tell these men to leave your husband alone. You are embarrassing yourself. You do not have a board of directors. You do not even have a real job. You format cheap spreadsheets for pocket change. Stop this ridiculous theatrical nonsense before Gavin presses criminal charges against you." Wyatt slowly turned his head to look at Gavin, then at my mother. He did not raise his voice. He did not display even a fraction of an emotion. He simply leveled a stare of such freezing, profound emptiness at them that both Gavin and Beatrice instantly fell silent. The raw, unfiltered corporate power radiating from Wyatt was not something they could argue with. It was an immovable object, and they were incredibly fragile glass. "There is no theatrical nonsense occurring here today," Wyatt stated, his tone perfectly even and absolutely uncompromising. "You are currently standing in the presence of the sole founder and chief executive officer of Nexus Data. She is the principal architect of the most advanced predictive analytics firm in the global market." Gavin swallowed hard, his chest heaving nervously. Nexus Data, he repeated the name, clearly registering in his mind. As a financial executive at Vanguard Financial, Gavin would undoubtedly know the name Nexus Data. It was the white whale of the tech industry, a highly secretive stealth mode enterprise that every major investment bank had been desperately trying to identify and invest in for the last 3 years. The firm was famous for its revolutionary algorithms and its ruthlessly anonymous leadership team. "That is impossible," Gavin whispered, shaking his head in rapid, frantic denial. Nexus Data is a phantom company. Nobody knows who runs it. The CEO operates through blind trusts and corporate proxies. You are telling me my lazy, unmotivated wife is the head of a global tech empire. I see her every single day. She sits in the spare bedroom wearing sweatpants. She is a glorified typist. Wyatt did not flinch. Your profound ignorance regarding your wife's professional capabilities does not alter the objective reality of her monumental success, he replied coldly. For the past 6 years, Madam CEO has utilized this residence as a secure remote operational headquarters. The freelance gig you so frequently disparaged was a carefully constructed security protocol designed to protect her intellectual property and maintain her necessary anonymity in a highly aggressive corporate landscape. Brittany let out a soft, horrified whimper. Gavin's face had drained of all color, transforming into a sickly ashen gray. The realization was hitting him like a runaway freight train. The quiet, unassuming woman he had constantly verbally abused, the wife he had confidently cheated on because he thought she had nowhere else to go, was secretly a titan of industry. And just to ensure there is absolutely no remaining ambiguity regarding the scale of her achievements, Wyatt continued delivering the final devastating blow with surgical precision. As of market close yesterday afternoon, following our latest round of aggressive corporate restructuring Nexus, Data officially reached a verified private valuation of $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion. The number echoed off the walls, crushing the remaining air out of the living room. My mother let out a tiny, strangled gasp, her knees buckling slightly as the sheer magnitude of the wealth washed over her greedy, status-obsessed mind. She had spent my entire life worshipping my brother Mason for starting a pathetic failed cryptocurrency project that lost a few $100,000. Now she was standing in the same room as a daughter who controlled billions. Gavin physically swayed, bracing his hand against the custom wet bar to keep himself from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. 2.5 billion, he murmured, his voice completely hollow. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, seeing me clearly for the very first time. He was not looking at a dependent housewife anymore. He was looking at an apex predator who could buy and sell his entire existence without a second thought. I sat perfectly still in my armchair, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my entire body. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or engage in petty arguments. I simply looked at the sleek titanium briefcase resting in my lap. The waiting was finally over. The invisible shield I had worn for 6 long years was coming down. This briefcase contained the culmination of years of relentless, invisible work. It held the legal documents, the forensic accounting reports, and the highly sensitive corporate acquisition files that would systematically destroy every single lie Gavin and my mother ever told. It was the physical manifestation of my ultimate freedom and their downfall. The heavy stillness felt electric, charging the atmosphere with an intense, undeniable finality. I pressed my thumbs against the dual biometric locks positioned securely on top of the briefcase. The small digital sensors glowed green, reading my fingerprints with a soft, confirming beep. The heavy latches snapped open simultaneously, creating a crisp mechanical sound that rang out loudly. I lifted the heavy lid, ready to end this miserable charade once and for all. Inside the briefcase, resting against the plush charcoal velvet lining, was a single thick dossier bound in heavy black leather. It was not a chaotic pile of loose papers or haphazardly printed emails. It was a flawless, professionally bound legal folio stamped with the unmistakable silver crest of Nexus Data. Right beside that crest, rendered slightly smaller to indicate its newly subservient status, was the familiar navy blue logo of Vanguard Financial. I reached inside and curled my fingers around the cool leather binding, pulling the heavy dossier out into the light. The room remained trapped in a breathless, suffocating silence. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused, leaving nothing but the sound of my own steady heartbeat thumping in my ears. I held the dossier out toward Gavin. He did not move at first. He just stared at the black leather as if I were offering him a live explosive. His chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts, his tailored charcoal suit suddenly looking entirely too large for his shrinking frame. He was absolutely terrified of what was printed on those pages. But his deeply ingrained corporate instincts, the very instincts he had prided himself on for his entire adult life, ultimately forced his hand. His right arm lifted, moving with stiff, jerky hesitation, and he took the dossier from my grasp. The heavy weight of the document seemed to physically pull his shoulders down. "Open it, Gavin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the undeniable force of an absolute command. "Read the executive summary on the very first page. I want you to see exactly what I was doing in the guest bedroom while you were busy buying cheap wine for your mistress." His hands were shaking so violently that he struggled to pry the heavy leather cover open. When he finally managed to flip the page, his eyes darted down to the bold, crisp text printed at the top of the executive summary. I watched his pupils track back and forth across the first few sentences. I watched his lips part slightly as he silently mouthed the words. I watched the last remaining shreds of his arrogant, untouchable reality fracture and dissolve into absolute nothingness. "This is a merger agreement!" Gavin breathed out, his voice thin and hollow, completely stripped of its usual booming resonance. "It is a hostile acquisition protocol. Nexus data. You bought the controlling shares. You bought out the private equity stakeholders." "I did not buy them out, Gavin." I corrected him, my tone perfectly, even and dripping with icy precision. "I aggressively consumed them. Vanguard Financial was severely overleveraged, bloated with middle management redundancies, and practically bleeding capital from your underperforming commercial divisions. My board of directors identified the weakness 6 months ago. We spent the last 2 quarters quietly purchasing your debt and acquiring the controlling voting rights through a series of anonymous shell companies. By the time your incredibly incompetent executive board realized what was happening, we already owned the building you work in and the servers you type on." Gavin stared at the paper, a drop of cold sweat forming at his hairline and sliding slowly down his pale temple. "But the board meeting today," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he tried to piece his shattered universe back together. "The emergency meeting the CEO called this afternoon. They said it was to finalize the quarterly promotions. They told me I was going to be named senior vice president. They practically guaranteed it." I let out a soft, humorless laugh that made him flinch physically. "They did not call that emergency meeting to promote you, Gavin. They called that meeting because my legal team was forcing them to sign the final surrender documents. You were never going to be a senior vice president. You were just a highly expendable pawn on a chessboard you did not even know existed." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was looking directly up into his terrified, unblinking eyes. "You aren't getting promoted to senior vice president, Gavin," I stated, letting every single word land with devastating, crushing weight. "As of 10 minutes ago, your entire commercial division was deemed financially redundant and completely liquidated. You are unemployed." The dossier slipped from his trembling hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, definitive smack. The crisp white pages spilled out over his polished leather shoes. He staggered backward, shaking his head in rapid, frantic denial. "No," he gasped, his breathing turning into a ragged, desperate wheeze. "No, you cannot do that. You cannot just erase my job. I have contracts. I have vested stock options. I have a guaranteed severance package written into my executive agreement. You cannot just fire me." "I did not fire you, Gavin," I replied calmly. "Firing you implies you still had a job to be dismissed from. I completely dissolved the entity that employed you. Your division no longer exists on any corporate registry. And as for your precious stock options, you might want to consult a financial advisor." When Nexus Data executed the hostile takeover, Vanguard shares plummeted. Your vested options are currently worth less than the paper they are printed on. And because your division was liquidated under a structural redundancy clause, your golden parachute severance package is entirely null and void. You are walking away with absolutely nothing. Brittany let out a loud, piercing gasp from her place near the front window. She lunged forward, her high heels clicking frantically against the wood as she grabbed Gavin by the arm, digging her manicured fingernails into his tailored suit jacket. "Gavin, what is she talking about?" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the quiet room. "If the commercial division is liquidated, what happens to my job? I am a junior executive in your department. You promised me a massive promotion when you made senior vice president. You promised me we were going to Paris. Gavin could not even look at her. He just stared blankly at the wall behind my head, his entire existence reduced to ashes in a matter of seconds. Wyatt, who had been standing silently by my side like a shadow of impending doom, finally spoke up, his deep voice cutting through Brittany's rising hysteria. Your position has also been permanently terminated, Miss Wyatt informed her with absolute freezing indifference. Your keycard to the Vanguard Financial Corporate building was deactivated exactly 12 minutes ago. Your company email access has been securely revoked, and any attempt to enter the premises on Monday morning will be treated as criminal trespassing by our private security contractors. Brittany's mouth opened and closed in silent, absolute horror. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her heavy makeup looking garish and absurd. She had hitched her entire wagon to a man she believed was a rising corporate star, eagerly participating in the cruel destruction of his marriage for the promise of luxury and status. Now, in the blink of an eye, she was standing in a stranger's living room, completely unemployed, stripped of her corporate credentials, and tied to a man who had zero financial prospects. You lied to me, Brittany screamed violently, shoving Gavin away from her. He stumbled completely off balance, nearly knocking over a floor lamp. You told me you were untouchable. You told me you were the most important asset at Vanguard Financial. You are nothing but a total fraud. I am not a fraud, Gavin yelled back, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. I am a top-tier executive. This is highly illegal. I am going to call my lawyers. I am going to sue Nexus Data for wrongful termination. I will drag you through the courts for decades, Melody. I will tear your precious little company apart piece by piece. You are more than welcome to try, Gavin, I said, returning to my armchair and sitting down with perfectly composed grace. But you signed a standard-at-will employment contract when you joined Vanguard Financial 7 years ago. You agreed to the structural redundancy clauses. My legal team at Nexus Data is comprised of the most ruthless, brilliant corporate attorneys on the entire Eastern Seaboard. If you attempt to file a frivolous lawsuit against a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate, they will bury you in so much litigation debt that your grandchildren will be paying off the legal fees. Gavin stared at me from across the living room, breathing hard, his face shifting rapidly between disbelief and rage. Losing his title had stunned him, but humiliation was something he could never tolerate for long. I watched the panic in his eyes search for another weapon, another number, another piece of leverage he could use to drag himself back above me. Then his expression changed. A thin, desperate smile pulled across his mouth, as if he had suddenly remembered the rules of a game he still believed he could win. Fine, he said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle in the silent room. Fine. You bought Vanguard. You destroyed my division. Congratulations, Melody. Enjoy your little victory. But you just made the biggest mistake of your life by admitting all of this before the divorce is finalized. You are worth $2.5 billion, and I am still your husband. 6 years of marriage means I am entitled to half. Half of everything. Half of Nexus Data. Half of your investments. Half of whatever accounts you have been hiding. You can fire me from a company, but you cannot fire me from a marriage. Do you hear me, Melody? Gavin continued. You thought you were clever hiding all this from me, but secrecy does not erase marital law. My attorneys will subpoena every account, every corporate record, every asset connected to your name. I will take this house, I will take a stake in your company, and I will make sure you spend years paying me for the privilege of humiliating me tonight. You want to play hardball, I can play hardball too. I let the silence stretch until Gavin mistook it for uncertainty. That is right, he said, pointing toward me. Now you understand. You cannot keep everything. And this house is mine regardless. I have paid for it every month for 6 years. I paid the mortgage. I paid the property taxes. I paid the insurance. My money kept this roof over your head while you were hiding your fortune from me. If nothing else, this property belongs to me. I looked at Wyatt. He did not need an explanation. He stepped toward the titanium briefcase, removed a slim charcoal folder from the lower compartment, and handed it to me. Unlike the acquisition dossier, this folder carried no Vanguard logo. Across the front was the name of a private holding entity, Gavin had seen hundreds of times without ever asking what it meant. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. "You should read more carefully before you threaten people with documents, Gavin," I said. His eyes dropped to the folder. I opened it and removed the first set of papers. The top page was not a bank statement or a corporate press release. It was a trust instrument dated years before our wedding. "Nexus data was not created during our marriage," I continued. "The intellectual property, founding equity, and controlling interests were placed inside an irrevocable blind trust before I ever walked down the aisle with you. The structure existed before you became my husband. The ownership chain, the voting rights, and the asset protections were reviewed repeatedly by independent counsel. You were never a beneficiary, you were never a trustee, you never contributed capital to the company, and you never acquired an ownership interest in it." Gavin stared at the date on the first page. His lips moved silently as he read it twice. No, he whispered. "You cannot just put billions in a trust and pretend they do not exist." "I am not pretending anything," I replied. "The trust exists. It existed before this marriage. Your lawyers are welcome to examine it. In fact, I encourage them to. They will charge you several $1,000s to explain what these pages already say very clearly." His hand tightened around the edge of the folder. Then he shook his head violently. "The house," he snapped. "Forget the company. This house is marital property. I have 6 years of payments proving it." I reached beneath the trust documents and removed a certified property deed. I held it by the top edge for a moment so he could see the legal description of the residence, then placed it directly in front of him. "Read the owner line." Gavin looked down. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the muscles in his jaw stopped moving. The deed did not list Gavin Miller. It did not list Melody Miller. It did not list us jointly. The legal owner was a Shell Limited Liability Company, whose sole managing member was one of the holding entities controlled by my premarital trust. Brittany moved closer, staring over his shoulder. "What does that mean?" she asked quietly. "It means exactly what it says," I answered. "This residence is not Gavin's personal property. It is not marital property held in either spouse's name. It is a corporate asset owned by an LLC managed through my trust." Gavin's face reddened again. "That is impossible. I have a mortgage statement every month." "No," I said. "You have a monthly occupancy statement from a property management company. You called it a mortgage because that is what you wanted it to be. You never asked why there was no lender listed on your credit report. You never asked why no deed with your name was recorded. You never asked why the payment portal identified the transaction as a residential lease obligation. You saw a large payment leave your account every month and decided that made you the owner." Wyatt reached into the folder and placed 6 annual summaries on the table. Each one showed the same management company collecting Gavin's monthly payments and transferring them to the holding entity. Gavin grabbed the first sheet, then the second. His eyes raced over the columns. I watched the truth land in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then absolute horror. "You mean I was paying rent?" he asked. "Yes." "To this company?" "Yes." He looked at me. I leaned back in the armchair. "You've been paying rent to my company for 6 years, Gavin. You own nothing. But I paid for renovations," he said, finally, his voice barely audible. "The kitchen, the flooring, the landscaping. I paid for improvements." "You paid for improvements to a property you were permitted to occupy," I said. "Much of that work was reimbursed through the management account, which you would know if you had ever read the statements instead of throwing them into a drawer. The rest was voluntary spending you approved because you believed displaying wealth made you powerful. None of it gave you title." His eyes darted toward the staircase. "My suits are upstairs. My furniture is here. My office is here. Your personal belongings are yours," I replied. "The structure is not. The land is not. The fixtures purchased by the holding company are not. And your presence here after permission is revoked becomes a completely different legal issue." One of the security guards near the foyer shifted almost imperceptibly. Gavin noticed. The last of his aggression collapsed into visible fear. Gavin dropped the deed onto the table as though it had burned his fingers. "This is fraud," he muttered. "You tricked me." "No, Gavin. I allowed you to believe what you wanted to believe. You never asked questions because the version where you were the wealthy provider and I was the dependent wife made you feel important. You built your identity on assumptions, and tonight those assumptions finally met the paperwork. He stared at the scattered documents surrounding his shoes, the takeover dossier proving his career was gone, the trust instrument proving he had no claim to my corporate empire, and the deed proving the house he had ordered me to leave was never his. 3 different versions of the same truth surrounded him. He had never possessed the power he thought he had. For the first time that evening, Gavin did not argue. He simply stood in the middle of the living room, pale and silent, while the ownership documents lay open in front of him. His job was gone. His imagined fortune was unreachable. His house was not his house. Every threat he had used against me had been stripped away one page at a time. My mother, Beatrice, who had been sitting frozen on the sofa, suddenly jolted upright. The reality of the situation had finally penetrated her thick, status-obsessed skull. The man she had just fiercely defended, the man she had proudly claimed was the savior of her family, was entirely bankrupt. He possessed no power, no wealth, and no future. The shiny illusion of his success had evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic broken shell of a man. Beatrice looked at Gavin with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust, her loyalties shifting with the speed of a striking viper. She realized instantly that she had aggressively backed the losing horse, and she was currently sitting in the crosshairs of a daughter who controlled more wealth than she could ever possibly fathom. "Melody," my mother stammered, her voice suddenly taking on a sickly, desperate sweetness. "Melody, darling, please. We need to calm down and talk about this rationally. You are clearly a brilliant, successful woman. I always knew you had this incredible hidden potential inside of you. I was just trying to push you to achieve your greatness. You must know I only wanted what was best for you." I looked at the woman who had just gleefully offered to lock me in her guest bedroom and charge me rent. I looked at her expensive cream pantsuit and her vintage pearls. The time for the next phase of the execution had arrived, and I was going to dismantle every single delusion they had left. My mother took a slow, tentative step away from the beige sofa. She carefully stepped over the scattered pages of the hostile acquisition dossier that were still resting on the hardwood floor near Gavin and his polished leather shoes. The sheer speed with which she adjusted her entire moral compass was genuinely breathtaking to witness. She smoothed the front of her expensive cream pantsuit, pushing her shoulders back and lifting her chin as she completely discarded the man she had fiercely defended just moments earlier. Gavin was suddenly nothing more to her than a useless, broken liability. He had lost his corporate power, and therefore he had lost all value in her calculating eyes. She directed all of her attention entirely to me. Her face transformed, shifting from an expression of panicked desperation into a sickeningly sweet maternal smile that made my stomach churn. "Oh, Melody, my darling girl," Beatrice crooned, taking another cautious step toward my armchair. Her voice was dripping with a thick, artificial warmth that I had never once heard directed at me during my entire childhood. "I am just so incredibly proud of you. I always knew you possessed this remarkable hidden genius. When I pushed you all those years, when I criticized your choices, I was only trying to draw out this magnificent potential. I was trying to prepare you for this exact level of immense corporate success. You have built an absolute empire right under our noses, and you did it with such remarkable grace and flawless discretion." I sat perfectly still watching her perform this pathetic, desperate routine. She actually extended her arms slightly, as if she intended to walk across the living room and embrace me. The 2 security guards flanking Wyatt immediately shifted their weight, stepping forward just a fraction of an inch to block her path. My mother stopped instantly, her artificial smile faltering as she recognized the impenetrable physical barrier between us. She lowered her arms, clasping her manicured hands together in front of her chest, and opting to continue her transparent flattery from a safe distance. "You must understand how difficult it has been for me to watch you settle for a man like Gavin." My mother continued, shaking her head with an expression of profound manufactured disappointment. "I always knew he was completely unworthy of your brilliance. Look at him cowering there like a pathetic child. He could never appreciate a woman of your incredible stature. He is a weak, foolish man, and you are so much better off without him dragging your phenomenal company down. But now that you are free from his suffocating mediocrity, we can finally focus on the future of our family." Beatrice took a deep breath, her eyes shining with renewed greedy ambition. She was already mentally calculating how she could leverage my $2.5 billion valuation to elevate her own social standing at the country club. She completely ignored the fact that she had just ordered me to move into her guest bedroom. In her mind, the slate was entirely wiped clean by the sheer magnitude of my wealth. "This is the perfect opportunity for you and your brother to join forces," Beatrice announced, her tone shifting from cloying sweetness to eager business negotiation. "Mason has been working so incredibly hard on his cryptocurrency startup, but the market has been terribly unfair to him recently. He is a true visionary Melody. He has that aggressive entrepreneurial spirit that could take Nexus data to entirely new heights. You have the capital and the infrastructure, and he has the brilliant creative ideas. If you bring Mason onto your executive board as a managing partner, the two of you would be absolutely unstoppable. You could build a generational family dynasty." Gavin promised to help him secure some funding, but obviously Gavin is a complete failure who cannot even keep his own job. "Your brother needs you, Melody, and you need someone you can actually trust by your side." I listened to her pitch with a cold, detached fascination. She was truly standing in my living room, completely surrounded by my private corporate security detail, actively begging me to hand over a massive portion of my multi-billion-dollar tech firm to a brother who had never worked a single honest day in his entire privileged life. She believed her maternal authority still carried weight. She believed she could simply talk her way into the vault. I slowly turned my head to look at Wyatt. I did not need to speak a single command. He anticipated my exact requirement with flawless operational efficiency. He stepped forward and opened the sleek titanium briefcase for a second time. Inside, resting beneath the empty space where the Vanguard financial acquisition dossier had been, was a second folder. This one was a bright, glaring crimson red. Wyatt lifted the heavy red folder and handed it to me with both hands before stepping back into his protective stance. I rested the crimson folder on my lap. I finally looked directly at my mother, my expression devoid of any forgiveness or familial warmth. "You speak so highly of Mason and his visionary entrepreneurial spirit." Beatrice, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm that echoed clearly across the room. "You consistently praise his incredible dedication to his cryptocurrency startup, but you clearly have no idea what my company actually does. Nexus Data does not just build generic software. We develop the most aggressive, sophisticated predictive analytics and forensic accounting algorithms on the planet. We track hidden digital assets, we uncover obscured corporate vulnerabilities, and we trace complex financial networks across the globe." I slowly opened the cover of the heavy red folder. The first page was a highly detailed forensic financial schematic mapping out a massive web of illicit wire transfers. I pulled the document out and held it up for her to see. So when my board of directors targeted Vanguard Financial for a hostile takeover, my software automatically ran a comprehensive internal audit of their commercial division. We needed to evaluate their liabilities before we consumed their assets. And during that routine audit, my algorithms uncovered a very fascinating, very illegal pattern of financial behavior, originating directly from Gavin's executive department. Gavin let out a loud, suffocating gasp from his place near the front window. He stumbled away from Brittany, crashing hard against the wall. His hands flew up to his head, his fingers digging frantically into his styled hair as the absolute horror of his reality finally crashed down upon him. He knew exactly what was inside that red folder. I was not funneling his own personal corporate bonus to your beloved golden child. Beatrice, I continued, speaking with slow, deliberate articulation, so every single word landed with maximum devastation. Gavin was aggressively embezzling restricted corporate funds directly from Vanguard financial client accounts. He was stealing massive amounts of money from his own firm to keep Mason from facing total financial ruin. My mother staggered backward, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. She looked at Gavin, who was now sliding slowly down the wall, until he hit the hardwood floor, pulling his knees to his chest in a posture of complete and utter defeat. Embezzling, my mother whispered, her voice shaking violently. No, that is impossible. Mason told me Gavin was investing personal capital into the crypto firm. There is no crypto firm, Beatrice, I stated coldly, correcting her delusional narrative once and for all. Mason has never run a legitimate technology startup in his life. His entire business was a fake front designed to hide a catastrophic gambling addiction. Mason lost hundreds of thousands betting on illegal offshore syndicates, I said, dropping a highlighted bank statement on the table. Gavin embezzled corporate cash to pay off those violent debts. But he could not transfer the money directly without triggering federal alarms. He needed a secure conduit to launder the transfers. You allowed your personal accounts to wash the stolen funds. Beatrice, you enabled his deceit, and you profited from his corporate crimes. The total destruction of their toxic hierarchy was finally complete. Wyatt, I said, hand these files to the SEC and federal authorities at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Wyatt closed the heavy crimson folder with a sharp snap that echoed like a gunshot through the paralyzed room. It will be done exactly as you have instructed, Madam CEO, he replied, his voice completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. I will have the corporate legal team transmit the encrypted digital copies to the federal field office immediately, and physical hard copies will be hand-delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission the very moment their doors open for business tomorrow morning. Brittany, who had been trembling near the bay window, suddenly let out a frantic gasp. The illusion she had so desperately clung to was shattering into pieces all around her. She looked at Gavin, not with the gaze of a future corporate wife, but with the eyes of a woman who realized she was shackled to a sinking anchor. She had gambled her own career on a man who promised her massive promotions, luxury vacations in Paris, and a life of effortless wealth. Now that exact man was not only completely unemployed and entirely broke, but he was also actively facing a massive federal indictment for severe corporate embezzlement. You lied to me! Brittany shrieked, her voice breaking as she took a step away from him. Her hands were shaking so violently that the wine she had been swirling in her glass sloshed over the rim, spilling a red stain onto the hardwood floor. She did not even notice the mess she was making. She just stared at Gavin as if he were a highly contagious disease. You told me you were managing massive lucrative portfolios. You told me you were the smartest man at Vanguard Financial. You are nothing but a common thief. You stole from the company we both worked for. You dragged me into this situation, and now my entire professional reputation is completely ruined because of your arrogance. Gavin looked up from the floor, his face a mask of terror. Brittany, please, you have to understand, he begged, reaching a hand out toward her. I was going to replace the missing money before the quarterly audit. I had a foolproof plan to fix it. We can still fix this together. We can hire aggressive lawyers and figure out a defense strategy. Just do not walk out on me now. Do not touch me, Brittany screamed, recoiling from his outstretched hand as if it were coated in burning acid. Her crystal wineglass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the floor, sending sharp shards of expensive glass and pools of dark red liquid splashing across the wood. She did not stop to look at the chaotic destruction. She simply turned and ran toward the front hallway, her high heels sliding frantically against the slick, polished floor. I am not going down with you, Gavin. You are a complete fraud and a criminal, and I sincerely hope the federal authorities lock you away for a very long time. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind her, the thunderous sound reverberating heavily through the silent house. She had fled into the dark evening, completely abandoning the man she had so proudly flaunted just an hour earlier. She left Gavin exactly as she had found him, entirely alone and actively drowning in the devastating consequences of his own arrogance. My mother let out a sob, completely shattered by the sheer velocity of the destruction happening around her. The reality of the federal investigation had finally penetrated her thick walls of profound denial. She realized with absolute clarity that by allowing her personal bank accounts to be used as a conduit for the stolen funds, she was no longer just an innocent bystander. She was an active, willing participant in a massive crime. Her social status, she valued far above the well-being of her own daughter, was going to be completely obliterated the moment the authorities arrived. Beatrice screamed, her voice raw and hoarse with panic. You told me those money transfers were perfectly legal investments. You sat in my kitchen drinking my coffee, and you swore to me that you were just helping Mason get his visionary business off the ground. You completely lied to me. You used my private checking accounts to launder your filthy stolen money. Gavin remained curled on the floor, shaking his head in denial. Beatrice, you knew Mason was heavily gambling. He cried out, his voice cracking painfully under the crushing pressure. You begged me to help him. You told me you would do anything to keep his massive failures out of the public eye. You knew exactly where that large amount of money was coming from. I did not know you were actually stealing from your own company, my mother shrieked, stepping forward and kicking the scattered pages of the dossier away from her shoes. You have completely destroyed my son. You took advantage of Mason when he was vulnerable, and you dragged my family name into a massive criminal conspiracy. I will tell the federal authorities everything, Gavin. I will testify against you in open court. You are a monster, and you have ruined my perfect family. My mother collapsed onto the edge of the sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing. She was not crying for me, and she was not crying out of any genuine remorse for the way she had treated me. She was crying exclusively for herself, mourning the death of her carefully curated social illusion. Gavin realized with clarity that his fiercely loyal mother-in-law was preparing to throw him directly under the bus to save her own skin. His mistress had abandoned him. His career was liquidated. His finances were non-existent, and the federal government was going to dismantle his freedom by morning. He had literally nowhere else to turn. He slowly shifted his heavy weight on the hardwood floor, turning his body until he was facing my armchair directly. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, his suit bunching and wrinkling awkwardly against the wood. He stopped just a few feet away from where I was sitting, looking up at me with wide eyes. He was a pathetic, broken shell of a man begging for his life. "Melody, please," Gavin sobbed. "They will lock me away for decades. I will never survive in federal prison. Please, I am begging you to show me some mercy." I sat perfectly still, looking down at the man who had just spent an hour trying to emotionally and financially destroy me. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering affection. I felt nothing but a cold clinical detachment. "You did not show me any mercy when you brought your mistress into my home." "Gavin," I said, my voice perfectly level and quiet. "You did not show me mercy when you handed me a predatory divorce settlement and tried to leave me with $10,000 while you funded my brother and his gambling addiction. You made your choices with absolute deliberate cruelty. Now you are simply experiencing the natural consequences of those actions." Gavin reached out a hand, lightly grasping the hem of my simple denim jeans. "Melody, I still love you." He wept, his chest heaving with breaths. "I swear to you, I still love you. I was just so stressed from work. I was confused. Brittany meant absolutely nothing to me. It was a mistake, and I regret it more than anything in the entire world. We can fix this. You are so brilliant and powerful now. You have billions of dollars. You can afford the best defense lawyers in the country. We can pay the stolen money back to Vanguard Financial together. We can make all of this go away, and we can finally be a real family. I will do whatever you ask me to do. I will quit my career and stay home while you run your empire. I will fully support your business, and I will never ever doubt your incredible intelligence again. I am so terribly sorry. Just give me one more chance to be the loving husband you always deserve." I looked down at the man kneeling on my hardwood floor. Tears were actively streaming down his flushed face, and his expensive charcoal suit was wrinkled and ruined. He was clasping his hands tightly together, pleading for his life, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant corporate executive who had confidently thrown a divorce settlement at me just an hour ago. I was offering to quit his non-existent career to become my supportive house husband, as if proximity to my wealth could somehow erase the 6 years of psychological abuse and financial manipulation he had inflicted upon me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or satisfaction. I looked down at him with absolute indifference. The man weeping at my feet was a complete stranger to me. The husband I thought I knew had never actually existed. I was just a hollow, greedy shell who had used my presence to make himself feel powerful. "You do not want to be a loving husband." "Gavin?" I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any lingering affection. You just want direct access to a $2.5 billion bank account. You do not love my intelligence or my business acumen. You are just absolutely terrified of being poor. If you genuinely cared about me as a person, you would not have spent the last 6 years treating me like a useless burden while you funneled stolen corporate cash to my gambling-addicted brother. You would not have brought your junior executive mistress into my living room to mock my clothing. Your apology is entirely hollow. It is nothing but a desperate, pathetic survival tactic from a man who realizes he is completely out of options. Gavin shook his head frantically, wiping a mix of sweat and tears from his pale face. No, Melody, please, you have to believe me. He choked out his chest, heaving with heavy, panicked sobs. I can change. I promise I will spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Just call off your lawyers. Just tell them to stop the federal investigation. I will do whatever you want. I am not calling off anyone, I replied, looking past him as if he were already a ghost. The wheels of corporate justice are already in motion, and I have absolutely zero interest in stopping them to save a thief. I slowly turned my head and made eye contact with the lead security guard standing near the front doorway. I signaled my security detail. The head of security immediately stepped forward, closing the distance between the entryway and the center of the living room in 3 long, purposeful strides. He reached into the deep pocket of his dark tactical suit jacket and pulled out a tightly folded package of thick black plastic. With a swift, aggressive flick of his wrist, the guard snapped the plastic open, revealing a standard heavy-duty industrial trash bag. The head of security tossed a black trash bag at Gavin's feet. It settled with a soft, crinkling sound that seemed incredibly loud in the heavy silence of the room. Gavin stared down at the empty garbage bag, his red-rimmed eyes wide with absolute profound confusion. He looked back up at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, unable to process what was happening. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack whatever fits in that bag, I dictated, my tone shifting into the cold, uncompromising voice of a chief executive officer executing a final eviction protocol. You may take your personal clothing, your basic toiletries, and the cheap watch you are currently wearing on your left wrist. You will leave behind any electronics purchased with Vanguard Financial Funds, including the smartphone currently sitting in your pocket. You will not touch the artwork, the furniture, or anything else in this house. After that, you are trespassing on corporate property, and my security detail will physically remove you from the premises. Gavin stared at me in total horror. 10 minutes, he whispered, his voice breaking into a high-pitched squeak. Melody, you cannot be serious. I cannot pack my entire life into a single garbage bag in 10 minutes. I have expensive suits upstairs. I have imported leather shoes. I have an entire wardrobe. Your 10 minutes started the moment the bag hit the floor. Gavin, I reminded him, ignoring his pathetic complaints entirely. I highly suggest you stop whining and start moving before you are forced to walk out into the cold night wearing nothing but the wrinkled suit you currently have on. The sheer freezing finality in my voice finally pierced through his dense layers of denial. The illusion that he could somehow negotiate or beg his way out of the situation completely evaporated. He looked at the intimidating security guard standing just a few feet away, ready to enforce my command with physical force. Pure, unadulterated panic overtook him. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, grabbing the black plastic trash bag with shaking hands, and bolted toward the staircase, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes in his frantic, desperate rush to salvage whatever tiny fraction of his material life he could carry. The sound of his heavy, frantic footsteps thudding up the hardwood stairs echoed loudly through the house. I did not watch him run. I slowly shifted my gaze back toward the sofa where my mother Beatrice was still sitting frozen in place. Her face was a masterclass in conflicting selfish emotions. She was terrified of my power, but she was also desperately trying to calculate a new angle, a new way to manipulate the situation, to ensure her own financial and social survival. She saw me looking at her, and immediately attempted to assemble a fragile, shaky mask of maternal affection. She stood up from the sofa, smoothing her cream-colored pantsuit with trembling hands. She completely ignored the fact that Gavin was currently running for his life upstairs. She was ready to abandon him entirely and focus all her manipulative energy on the daughter she had just spent an hour violently abusing. Melody, darling. My mother began, her voice cracking as she took a slow, hesitant step toward me. She reached a hand out in a pleading, placating gesture. This has all been such a terrible, chaotic misunderstanding. We were both just so incredibly stressed and overwhelmed by Gavin's lies. He manipulated both of us. He is a truly evil, deceptive man, and I am so deeply sorry I ever allowed him to speak to you that way in your own beautiful home. I remained perfectly still, watching her perform this disgusting, transparent routine. The absolute lack of shame she possessed was almost clinically fascinating to observe. "We can fix this," my mother continued, taking another cautious step forward, her eyes shining with desperate artificial hope. "You and I can sit down and talk through everything like a real family. We can hire the best defense lawyers in the country to protect your brother Mason. You know he is a good boy deep down. He just made some foolish financial mistakes with the wrong people. We can protect our family name together, Melody. I know I have been hard on you, but I am your mother and I love you so much." She actually tried to offer me a weak, watery smile, trying to play the role of the loving, supportive parent, as if she had not just ordered me to move into her guest bedroom and pay her rent. She genuinely believed she could simply appeal to my sense of childhood obligation and guilt me into opening my billion-dollar checkbook to save the golden child who had happily drained her bank accounts. I just looked at her with an expression of absolute and complete emotional indifference. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad or betrayed by the woman who had spent 34 years intentionally trying to destroy my self-worth. I turned to my mother, ending her pathetic rambling and staring straight into her cold, calculating eyes. "You came here to pick up your useless daughter. But she doesn't exist anymore. You have no daughter." I held my mother's shocked gaze for one final second. The finality of my words severed the last thread of obligation I felt toward her. Beatrice reached out a trembling hand, but no sound came out. I turned my back, dismissing her, and faced the heavy front door. Wyatt moved seamlessly to my side, anticipating my departure. He gestured toward the open entryway. The crisp air drifted in, carrying the scent of rain, and it felt like breathing for the first time. I walked out without a backward glance. My simple clothes felt like armor as I crossed the floor I had cleaned for 6 years. I stepped over the threshold, leaving behind the suffocating confines of a beautifully decorated prison. The two security guards fell into step behind me, ensuring neither Gavin nor Beatrice could follow. The driveway was bathed in the white light of the idling SUVs. The lead vehicle had its rear door held wide open by a driver wearing a dark suit. I walked down the paved walkway, my footsteps steady against the concrete. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of quiet exhilaration. Every step I took toward the waiting convoy was a step away from a lifetime of being treated like a burdensome afterthought. I reached the open door of the SUV and climbed into the plush leather interior. The cabin smelled of expensive upholstery and quiet efficiency. Wyatt stepped in after me, taking the seat opposite mine, and the driver closed the door with a solid thud that completely blocked out the ambient noise. We sat in a perfectly soundproofed cocoon of absolute corporate power. Through the deeply tinted glass of the window, I watched the pathetic remnants of my past life assemble in the driveway. The heavy front door swung open and Gavin stumbled out onto the porch. He clutched a flimsy black trash bag containing whatever random clothes he had managed to haphazardly shove inside. His expensive suit was hopelessly wrinkled and his face was a mask of absolute despair. He walked slowly down the porch steps and stopped on the edge of the curb, looking exactly like the discarded garbage he was holding. My mother emerged, practically tripping over her designer heels. She bypassed Gavin completely, not even glancing at the ruined man she had fiercely defended an hour earlier. She ran toward her leased silver Mercedes-Benz, frantically searching through her handbag for her keys. But she stopped dead in her tracks as she realized the brutal reality of her physical situation. Her shiny status symbol was completely boxed in by my massive security fleet. She was trapped in the driveway, entirely isolated and profoundly alone. Beatrice collapsed against the hood of her car, burying her face in her hands as her shoulders shook with violent sobs. She was weeping for the sudden catastrophic destruction of her carefully curated social illusion and the terrifying realization that her financial complicity was about to be exposed. I watched them both for a quiet moment, feeling a deep clinical detachment. They had already received their verdicts. I turned my attention forward and nodded to the driver. "Move out," I instructed softly. The driver engaged the vehicle and the heavy engine purred as we smoothly pulled away from the curb. The remaining SUVs fell into perfect formation behind us, executing a flawless synchronized departure. I leaned back into the comfortable leather seat, closing my eyes and letting the rhythmic motion carry me away. The toxic anchors that held me down for 34 years were finally cut loose. I was completely undeniably free. 6 months passed with the rapid, exhilarating velocity of a life lived without artificial restraints. The transition into the highly visible role of a corporate titan was seamless because I was no longer expending massive amounts of emotional energy, pretending to be small. I found myself sitting comfortably behind a polished mahogany desk in my penthouse office, located on the top floor of the glass skyscraper that served as the global headquarters for Nexus Data. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling city skyline. The morning sunlight streamed into the office, casting long, warm shadows across the pristine white carpet and the modern, minimalist artwork. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast as I reviewed the thick portfolio resting on my desk. This portfolio did not contain hostile acquisition protocols or defensive legal maneuvers. It contained the final structural blueprints for the Apex Initiative, a multi-million-dollar philanthropic fund I was personally launching by the end of the quarter. The fund was designed to provide unencumbered venture capital grants to female entrepreneurs who lacked access to traditional financial networks. I wanted to build an ironclad support system for women who had brilliant, world-changing ideas but were constantly being overlooked, underestimated, or actively suppressed by the arrogant men in their lives. I was utilizing the vast resources of my empire to ensure that no other woman with a visionary concept would ever have to hide her true potential in a guest bedroom just to survive a toxic, unsupportive environment. I flipped through the profiles of our first dozen grant recipients, feeling a profound sense of pride. I was no longer just acquiring wealth, I was actively redistributing power. As I signed my name at the bottom of the final authorization document, the soft murmur of the flat-screen television mounted on the far wall caught my attention. A major financial news network was broadcasting their mid-morning market update. I picked up the remote control and unmuted the volume, leaning back in my executive chair to watch the breaking headlines scroll across the bottom of the screen. The news anchor, a stern-looking man in a crisp suit, was reporting on the latest developments in a massive federal fraud investigation that had sent shockwaves through the financial sector. Former Vanguard financial executive Gavin Miller and local cryptocurrency founder Mason Anderson were officially indicted by a federal grand jury early this morning, the anchor announced, his voice carrying the detached tone of objective journalism. The two men are facing multiple felony charges, including severe corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. Authorities allege that Miller systematically siphoned restricted corporate funds to cover Anderson's illicit offshore gambling debts over a period of 3 years. Both men have been denied bail due to flight risks and are currently awaiting trial in federal custody. The anchor paused as a grim, unflattering photograph of Gavin and Mason being escorted out of a courthouse in handcuffs flashed onto the screen. Furthermore, sources confirm that Beatrice Anderson, mother to one of the defendants, has filed for personal bankruptcy after federal regulators seized her private assets in connection with the laundering scheme. I muted the television, letting the profound silence of my secure elevated office wrap around me. The justice had been swift, brutal, and entirely comprehensive. Gavin had lost his corporate identity and was facing a very long, miserable stretch in a federal penitentiary. Mason's fraudulent house of cards had completely collapsed, exposing him as the pathetic dependent addict he truly was. And my mother was now completely destitute, socially ruined, and permanently isolated from the country club circles she had so desperately tried to impress. They had built their lives on a foundation of cruel manipulation and arrogant entitlement, and when that foundation was removed, they had absolutely nothing left to stand on. I set the remote down and turned my chair back toward the expansive glass windows. The city spread out below me, a vast, complex network of opportunities and endless possibilities. I did not feel any lingering bitterness toward the people who had tried so hard to keep me down. They simply did not matter anymore. They were irrelevant footnotes in the history of my success. I smiled a genuine, radiant expression of pure contentment, looking out over the beautiful, chaotic world that I now commanded. The greatest revenge was not just destroying the people who abused me. The greatest revenge was ascending so high that their cruelty could no longer reach me, and reigning with absolute authority over a world they could never even dream to touch.